The Energy Chamber will always conduct a very thorough review of party manifestos when they get released. We'll look through them in a lot of detail. Particularly, obviously, we will look at the energy sector proposals, but we'll look at everything which the manifestos are saying. One of the things that's interesting about the manifestos is that they actually share a lot in common. There's a general philosophy which both the People's Partnership and the PNM have in their manifesto, which is around attracting foreign investment into our energy sector. Both of the manifestos recognise the importance of increasing investment into the upstream oil and particularly gas production, and they recognise that's about getting the right fiscal regime in place and all the right conditions within the sector to increase gas production. They also both put a lot of emphasis on renewable energy, which is perhaps something new, but there's a lot, particularly in the UNC manifesto, about renewable energy, which we haven't seen before. So if we look at the area of fiscal reform for the oil and gas industry, it's mentioned in both manifestos. A little bit more detail in the PNM manifesto. The PNM manifesto puts a lot of emphasis on sort of building consensus and discussions with the major players. It's also mentioned in the People's Partnership manifesto, but not quite as much detail. I think what's interesting is what neither of them say, which is anything specific about the reform area. So neither of them mention supplemental petroleum taxation, which has been the big issue, which has been discussed a lot, that's a disincentive for oil production. And neither mention anything to do with production sharing contracts. They don't really recognise the fact that a lot of our production, particularly of gas, comes from areas under production sharing contracts rather than under the exploration and production licenses. Changing the tax regime under the Petroleum Act doesn't actually change the conditions under the production sharing contract. And so there's no real discussion about how you're going to incentivize people operating under production sharing contracts. But obviously we need to find ways of incentivizing that to bring these stranded reserves into play. And that's a sort of a silence which both of the manifestos share. If then we look at sort of restructuring the gas value chain, which is another area which has been talked about a lot in the energy sector over the last few years because of these curtailments in gas production affecting Point Lisas and affecting Atlantic, and how do you restructure that relationship? Again, it's something which both of the manifestos mention. The PNM manifesto has quite a lot of detail around how they're going to go into negotiations and try to build consensus about how you change that situation. Also mentioned in the People's Partnership manifesto as well. What's interesting is that neither of the manifestos mentions the gas master plan. It's quite surprising that's not mentioned in the People's Partnership manifesto. That's a sort of a major plank of what's been done in the sector over the recent past, and this gas master plan has just recently been completed, but it's not mentioned in the manifesto. And I think people in the industry are looking to that gas master plan as the tool which is going to be used for those discussions and those conversations about restructuring the gas value chain. All of that is about incentivizing upstream gas production. The People's Partnership manifesto mentions cross-border gas, the gas with Venezuela, which is seen as one of the sources of gas that we can bring in to use in Trinidad and Tobago. That's not mentioned in the PNM manifesto, but the PNM manifesto does mention deep water and the potential of using gas from deep water, recognizing how difficult that will be, and you'll need special conditions if that gas is going to be produced from the deep water, and you'll need to have particular specific terms for that gas to be produced. Interestingly, both of the manifestos talk quite a lot about energy service exports and internationalization of Trinidad and Tobago's energy sector. The People's Partnership manifesto looks particularly at a sort of a regional context. It talks about forging partnerships with Suriname and with Guyana, and even with northern Brazil and Colombia. Mentions also Barbados as well, and exploration work which is going on there. And it talks about the Caribbean Energy Transformation Fund, which the government has been working on with the IDB. PNM manifesto, you sense that they are looking at reviving the Africa Energy Initiative, which they had in the previous PNM government, and that's sort of coming through within what they're saying. What neither of the manifestos really addresses is how do you strengthen your local energy service companies and help them get out there around the world exporting. And there's no real discussion of programs to help the competitiveness of our firms in those international markets. And if you compare that to what a lot of other governments do and how they support their firms, that doesn't really come out as a strong theme in either of the manifestos. It talks about sectors and target markets, and doesn't really talk very much about companies, but it's actually companies who'll be doing the business. So we have to find ways of supporting our companies out there in the international markets if we are going to really deliver on this idea about exporting energy services. The People's Partnership Manifesto specifically mentions the lease-out programs, and that really is a mechanism whereby you have these oil and gas fields, small oil and gas fields, which Petrotrin is not really able to profitably produce, but you have smaller companies who can produce from those fields, and the idea is that getting more of that acreage into the hands of the smaller companies will allow us to increase oil production. We have seen that happen in the onshore oil sector over the last decade or so, where the small companies have increased their production onshore while Petrotrin's production has declined. Renewable energy and energy efficiency are two areas which get quite a lot of attention in both of the manifestos. There's quite a lot of detail, particularly in the People's Partnership Manifesto, around some of their plans around renewable energy. A lot of the things that they're doing currently at the moment now get mentioned in the manifesto, including the fact that they are now going to be certifying energy service companies in order to be able to take advantage of the tax break, which was introduced 5 years ago. So I'm glad they're now saying they're going to do this, which it's been on the to-do list for 5 years, but they're now saying they're actually going to do it. So I'm pleased about that. The P&M Manifesto also does talk quite a lot about renewable energy and energy efficiency, looking at it both in the context of ensuring that we have gas availability by being more efficient in how we're using gas, but also renewable energy, particularly for Tobago. It talks about working with the Tobago House of Assembly, so I think they're sort of seeing Tobago as a possible site to, I guess, fit along with the tourism product of being clean, green and serene, as the THA likes to put it. So the People's Partnership Manifesto obviously mentions the CNG program, something which they've been pushing hard for the last few years, but it also mentions reducing the transport fuel subsidies. It talks about pegging the transport fuel subsidy at $45 a barrel. I'm not quite sure what that means. We need to get some more detail to understand exactly what they're proposing there. But it also talks about completely removing the transport fuel subsidy from premium gasoline, which I think is something I'm a bit concerned about, because what we've seen in the past is if you create a big differential in price between premium and super gasoline, it just leads to people shifting to the lower cost fuels, to diesel and to super, and not using premium. And we saw that happen in 2012 when they increased the price of premium by quite a lot. You saw a big drop off in people purchasing premium, which is the cleaner of the fuels. So it's a bit of a perverse subsidy if you're encouraging people to use the less clean fuels.